1 year before Mormon settlers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley to set up a permanent home, another group of immigrants traveled through Utah on their way to California. Their trek through the mountains and desert of the Beehive State would prove to be their eventual undoing. This is the tale of the infamous Donner Party wagon train, and this is Below the Salt. All right, you ready for this?
I'm ready.
You ready for some Donner Party?
Yes.
What do you know about the Donner Party?
A lot.
Oh, really? Okay.
But not about the people specifically.
Okay, just about the spookiness.
Oh, yes.
There's some real spookiness here, the spookiness that is the human soul.
Yep, and now that I've seen The Shining like 1,000 times in the past year, it always makes me think of that too, because of the scene where they're driving up to the Overlook at first, and I think Wendy says that, like, oh, it's like the Donner Party.
She asks, I think she asks if this is where it happened.
And Jack's like, no.
It was further west.
Further west.
Yeah.
And then Danny's like, what's a cannibal?
Yeah. No,
Or no, he says, what's the Donner Party? And Jack says, oh, they were cannibals, son.
Yeah.
And Wendy's like, Jack. And Danny's like, I know what a cannibal is, Mom.
I saw it on TV.
I saw it on TV. And Jack's like, he saw it on TV.
See, honey? It's fine. He saw it on the television. That's my terrible
it was
Jack
pretty
Nicholson
good. You're pretty good at
Okay.
impressions.
Well, I haven't really brushed up on my Nicholson, so sometimes it takes a minute. All right. So, in the 1840s.
I just want to preface this too by saying really fast that I'm chilly down in our basement where we're recording.
You're chilly.
And I think it's very appropriate for the Donner Party
It
episode.
is, because it's going to get cold in here, lady cakes. Tell you what. All right, so in the 1840s, everyone has caught the move west bug.
Yup.
So
they going to get some gold?
What that is specifically 1849, hence San Francisco 49ers. Is when the big gold rush happened. But everyone was doing it for one reason or another. Some saw it as a promise of a more freely religious life, like the Mormons did. What?
That's just funny. Continue.
What? Oh, what?
And it's just funny that was the whole point of the Mormons moving here in the first place.
Because
and now we live here in Mormon country, and it's like, if you're not Mormon, you're a devil.
It's not more. Well, it's. I think by freely religious, they mean we control the religion, not someone else.
I totally know.
Yeah.
I totally know that. I just think it's funny because.
Yeah. Because we live in a very religious state. It was also a lot of Catholics actually moved from back east because Protestantism was very big in the East, and they were not treated well.
Yep.
They were like it was like Islamophobia
I just like
is now.
Religious freedom, how it's like under the guise of, oh, you can be whatever religion you want and we'll be tolerant, when that's not really what it is.
It's like
I was
you should
just
be
laughing
like
at the irony.
That you're moving to Utah to be free from religion.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. Okay. So, most you're such a weirdo. All right. A lot of them, the majority of them, were tempted by possible economic opportunities. Of course, California was this huge arable, fantastic place.
Yep.
Where you could get land for pretty cheap in the 1840s.
Yep.
Not so much the case today. Nearly all of these people took the Oregon Trail. You know the Oregon Trail, right?
I died of dysentery.
You did? Well, I died of dysentery a fair bit on the. We're of course referencing the Oregon Trail video game that everyone played in elementary or middle school or whatever.
I've actually never ever played it.
You've never played it?
Ever.
It's super fun actually.
But
I loved it. Okay. So on the Oregon Trail, they would of course risk life and limb and the possibility of dysentery.
Yep.
For a better life. The Oregon Trail leads from Independence, Missouri, where people would get on from the Mississippi River, and they would follow rivers across the Great Plains, mostly the Platte River, to the Continental Divide, typically at the South Pass in Wyoming, all while traveling about 15 miles per day, either on foot or on horseback or in the back of an ox.
That sounds horrible.
It's not fun. Actually, funnily enough, if any of our listeners, I assume a lot of our listeners are from Utah, there's a thing that LDS communities do very often.
Oh my god, I'm so glad. Even when I was religious, I never had to do this shit.
I had to do it. It sucked
It's called
major.
Trek.
It's called Trek, and they try to recreate a handcart pole, which is it's a long story what a handcart pole is, but basically they have they send a bunch of teenagers to go out and do the same thing, and it's a super miserable experience, and it's made to build character
And you have to like
appreciate
you have
your
to wear
heritage.
period clothing. You know, like all the girls have to wear big heavy skirts, and the boys have to wear like long sleeves. And
My blisters had blisters.
Oh,
I'll just say that
yeah,
much.
I'm
it
so
was
glad. I almost
it was
did it once,
traumatic.
and I was like, that sounds stupid. And I was so lucky that my mom's cool and didn't
well,
make me
and
do
it's
it.
just like,
Even though
why
she
would the
wasn't religious
ancestors
either.
be? The ancestors would be like, if they heard about that, they'd be like, that's stupid. That was like the most miserable thing I did. Why would you want to go like
Mhm.
commemorate that? Like, just be happy that we got to where we wanted to go
Mhm.
alive. Anyway, it's really dumb, but that's what people did, and that's because, well, and back then they didn't have to walk the whole way.
Yeah, they got to go on the cart
Horses,
sometimes,
carts,
but
that sort of thing. And so once they got to Wyoming, they would have a choice of several options to continue towards the west coast. They could take the Oregon part of the trail through Idaho and therefore into Oregon, or they could take the California leg of the trail, which would also take you through Idaho and then down
Mhm.
south across the Sierra Nevadas. And in that spot in Wyoming, there's a place called Fort Bridger. In Fort Bridger, an enterprising young man, I don't know how old he was actually, I didn't look that up, named Lansford Hastings. He was trying to encourage people to take a more southern route to go to Fort Bridger so that his business would do better.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, isn't it always in movies? Isn't it always the businessman who's like, "Come do this,"
and it'll be great
because of his own business? Isn't he always like the bad guy?
He's kind of the bad guy here. I'll say it that much.
Cool.
So he published a guide to crossing the wilds of North America. And in this guide, he proposed that travelers could skip that pesky trip northward through Idaho's very safe and flat Snake River Valley and cut past Fort Bridger, conveniently trading with him at his business, and then cross through Utah's Wasatch Mountain Range and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. You may recall exactly how desolate, dry, and flat this desert is from movies like Independence Day,
yep,
or Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End.
Star Trek.
Yeah, all sorts of stuff has been filmed out there because it's just this alien landscape where
yeah,
it's
just weird.
It's a salt flatbed.
Yeah, when Jack and I went on our honeymoon a couple years ago, we went to San Francisco. It was great, and we drove back home through the desert out there.
We drove that way too.
Oh yeah, but when we were driving home, we went on our honeymoon in April.
It was April.
And when we were coming back, we happened to just come at this time where there was this crazy blizzard in
Donner Pass.
Yeah. And we totally talked about this the whole time. And then by the time we got through to the Salt Flats, we passed through like Wendover and we're coming back towards Salt Lake. There was a crazy windstorm,
Because there was the windstorm preceding the blizzard.
Yeah, it was only like a 2-lane road, a 2-lane highway going out there. And you couldn't see, more than
we were
5 feet in front of our car.
Yeah,
it was so crazy.
Absolutely terrifying.
And it was just from the salt getting blown up. It was nuts.
It was like a whiteout blizzard, but out in the middle of this
out in the salt.
dead man's land, salt flat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I-80 actually takes this route.
Yep.
It's actually a better, shorter route the way they did it, than to go up through Idaho and then back down.
Yeah, it's better these days.
Yes, because you're in a car and you can get through it in
and there's a
matter of
path
hours.
to go on.
Yeah, exactly. That was not the case back in 1846. All right, so oh man, it's about as barren and salty as it gets on planet Earth.
Yep.
But Hastings assured settlers that it was a smooth trip, devoid of rugged terrain or hostile natives, and with plenty of spots for water. Which, one of the only spots for water is the Great Salt Lake, which is not water you
can't
want.
drink that shit.
You really cannot. So, Hastings Cutoff is what this is called.
Mm-hmm.
It's a supposed shortcut. It's actually, when you add it all up, quite a bit longer than the Oregon Trail.
Dummy.
Yeah. Anything for $1, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as long as settlers timed their trip properly,
it was fine.
it would probably be fine. It would just be a little bit more miserable and a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
Not a shortcut. So, In the spring of 1846, a massive group of 500 wagons departed from Independence, Missouri, heading west. The final 9 wagons in this teeming mass of humanity was a group that consisted of 32 members of the Donner and Reed parties and their employees, a lot of hired hands. They managed to stay with the larger group for most of the pre-Wyoming journey, and they are even joined by a few members of the Murphy and Breen families. The Breens were Catholics looking forward to the Catholic-friendly lands of California. Along with a group of German immigrants comprised of several families, most notably the Kesebergs and the Wolfingers.
Cool.
And a few just single men that just happened to be traveling.
Cool.
At one point during a wagon delay on account of matriarch Tamsen Donner, she once said she once tempted fate by writing about this wagon delay. Indeed, if I do not experience something far worse yet than I have done, I shall say the trouble is all in getting started. So she's like, oh man, the worst part was just getting everything packed up to go. This isn't bad at all.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that about some things.
Oh yeah, well, and at this point, nothing had really gone wrong for them. So, but still, it's like, dun dun dun.
Oh. Girl, you jinxed it.
She's Tamsen. As most of the large wagon train pressed northward to Fort Hall and towards the Idaho leg of the trip, on the word of Hastings and the persistence of James Reed, who is the patriarch of the Reed family, our intrepid group decided to take the unknowingly perilous detour through Utah. The 2 largest families put up their patriarchs to vote as group leader, so George Donner and James Reed. They decided against the autocratic and aristocratic James Reed. He's just a rich jerk, basically. And selected the peaceful and charitable George Donner, despite his inexperience with the frontier life. At this point, another family, the McCutcheons, joined up, and they began heading southwest into Utah.
Okay.
So the Oregon Trail had been reliably used by settlers for years, and as such, it was well maintained and easily spotted. The Hastings Cutoff, not so much. It was a steep downhill trek, which often was more dangerous than an uphill climb for wagons because the wagon weight would push on the oxen.
Couldn't control it as well.
Yep. The canyons they traversed were full of boulders, sturdy shrubs, and cliffs overlooking beautiful but dangerous rivers.
Yes.
Somehow, in the midst of this canyoneering adventure, the Graves family managed to catch up to them again, bringing the total number to 87 souls in more than 60 wagons.
87.
Finally, they arrived at the Salt Lake Valley after going through all those crazy Utah canyons that have great snow, by the way. Not in this time of year.
Greatest snow on Earth.
Greatest snow on Earth. We got that.
We got that on our license plate.
We got that lake effect snow that
we do.
lays down a nice powder.
Too bad we don't like skiing or anything.
Yeah, we really don't.
Why do we live in Utah?
Yeah, I don't. Sometimes,
just kidding,
we do it just for
really
this.
like
we stay purely for Below the Salt podcast. So, we're sacrificing for you guys. So when they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, and rather than finding it the bustling mini metropolis of today, they saw the hot and dry, untamed nothingness of an 1846 August in Utah, complete with an undrinkable lake that stretched beyond the horizon. Their path forward was through the Bonneville Salt Flats, a flat, salty lake bed with only the water they carried with them. And they immediately, at this point, considered the wisdom of this Hastings Cutoff business and criticized James Reed for the foolhardiness that he had shown, but decided to press on regardless. The salt stung their faces and eyes as they carried across this white void. The weight of the wagons was enough to break through the salty crust of the lake bed and sink into the gummy salt mud that lies underneath, sometimes up to the hubs of the wagon wheels. Hot, blistering days turned into frigid, windy nights. Some oxen were abandoned due to the inability to move. Others, in their delirium, broke free and scattered into the desert.
Damn.
No human lives were lost in this leg of the trip, but the many critical beasts of burden were gone, and some wagons were critically damaged. In their trial in the desert, which according to Hastings should have been about 40 miles in about 2 or 3 days, instead ended up being 80 miles and 6 days of insufferable torture.
Ugh.
So, the group at this point had lost all faith in the Hastings Cutoff and in James Reed as well. And instead of being apologetic, Reed, who incurred the heaviest losses in the disastrous detour of Utah, doubled down and demanded inventories of everyone's supplies because he's like, oh, this is a crisis and I'm the rich guy in charge and I should be the one who decides,
how to ration and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Shit.
He's a jerk. The group soldiered on for the next 40 miles and finally regrouped with the original California Trail. So,
boom.
Things
looking up.
Yeah, things are looking up a little bit. Oh boy.
Oh, sweet summer children.
This is not going to go well. Hope seemed to be restored. The Hastings cutoff had already done its damage, though. The party had been delayed for an entire month longer than they had planned.
Ugh.
Because they went through the mountains and through the desert.
Yeah, that's no good.
Yeah. Timing these things is really important when you're crossing mountains.
Yes, it is.
Things started to unravel in October. When two wagons became tangled together, John Snyder, who was an employee of the Graves family, angrily beat the oxen of one of James Reed's hired hands. When James Reed began to interfere, Snyder whipped James Reed several times before Reed took a knife and plunged it under Snyder's collarbone, killing him.
Oh my god.
Since George Donner had already pressed on ahead before this incident, the wagon party members were authorized to execute the law as they wished on the west side of the Continental Divide, because it wasn't technically the United States yet.
Wow.
It was Mexico, and as such, the group, it's kind of like how international waters works.
Yeah.
Whatever flag you fly under, you decide what law you follow. So the party decided, instead of lynching him or whatever the other options were, to exile him from the group, and he took off ahead on the trail. He took off without them. And he has a very large family,
yes,
by the way. He's leaving behind all of his family. Without the burden of a wagon and with the assistance of one of his employees and his employee's horse, James Reed managed to cover 25 to 40 miles a day.
Wow.
He knew, for being a rich jerk, he actually knew what he was doing out here.
Okay.
And he took off without them.
Okay.
Because he was told to by the group. So he passed James Donner and Donner's family, and he made distance between them quite a bit.
Okay.
The Donner fragment and the Reed fragment rejoined eventually and continued onward, but the splintering of the groups was already worsening. Suspicions grew, hardships worsened, and everyone was forced to walk to keep the animals healthy because they'd suffered so much in the desert. And they're feeling it at this point because their supplies are running low. Yeah, it's not good.
Hungry.
They're hungry.
Probably
They're
thirsty.
very tired.
One
elderly gentleman with severely swollen feet was actually left behind, never to be seen again.
Sad.
Yeah. His feet were so swollen they're starting to split.
Oh my god. Oh. I wonder if he was diabetic.
It could just be from the injuries.
Yeah, I
but
believe it could be, but that's just interesting. I always think of that.
The chances of him being type 2 diabetic back in these days is low. No added sugars.
It's just interesting, though. I always think of that. It is interesting. Anyways.
The horses of the Graves family were chased off by Native Americans, who later returned and stole another 18 horses and killed an additional 21 horses.
Wow.
The party was down to nearly 100 animals, and the rations were almost gone. That's another thing, is that there are a lot of animals. There's livestock they're bringing out. There's all of their oxen and the horses.
Yeah, and you still gotta feed and
you gotta feed your animals. Too. Yeah.
So
but being down to 100 animals for 60 wagons is a huge problem.
Yeah.
At one point, with no oxen to pull his wagon, Mr. Wolfinger decided to bury his wagon in a cache instead, planning on returning to it someday. He set off to do the deed with two hired hands, Reinhardt and Spitzer, the two of his German employees, and they returned without Wolfinger, saying he had been killed by Native Americans in an attack. So they just went on without Mr. Wolfinger.
Wow.
After a very long trek across Nevada, the Donner Party finally arrived at the Truckee River, which is at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So they've made it across Nevada, but things are not looking great. It's not good. And they didn't have time to stop and rest for very long. One of their scouts who had gone ahead came back from Sutter's Fort, which was on the other side of the mountains in California. He brought food and mules and news that James Reed had also arrived in California, despite nearly starving on his own trip because he didn't have very many supplies on his single horse.
Wow.
But he did make it. The date was October 20th. Upon hearing that the mountains would not normally snow in until mid-November, the Donner Party was faced with the question of trying for one last push over the dangerous mountain pass or to rest up their animals.
Mhm.
When one of their strong men, William Pike, was accidentally killed by William Foster when he was cleaning his weapon,
Oh my God.
they decided they were so desperate and they just did not have time to wait, and they departed with the Donner family bringing up the rear.
Mhm.
As they started, an axle on a Donner wagon broke, slowing them down yet again, and George Donner was injured when he tried to repair the wagon.
Okay.
He injured his hand.
Ouch.
Yeah, that's a pretty critical part of your body.
Yeah.
The snow began to fall as the settlers attempted to climb the massive 1,000-foot slope up to Truckee Lake,
Mhm.
which is now known as Donner Lake.
Yes.
The Breens were the first to accomplish this feat, and they stopped at a cabin that had been built by previous trailgoers to rest.
That's nice of them.
Yeah. The Eddy and Kesselberg families tried to press on past the lake, but the snow continued to fall, and 10-foot snowdrifts halted their progress.
Oof.
If you've ever been in a snowdrift, you know that there's just no way around it. Like,
No.
it's
Yeah.
10 feet, and it's
That's
just
not
pure
happening.
powder. You're not pushing any animals or wagons through anything like that. All the families, except for the Donners themselves, who were a half day behind the rest of them, tried and failed to continue on. 60 members of the party, which is everyone but the Donners, decided to set up for winter in ramshackle cabins or hastily constructed lean-to shelters.
Mhm.
They probably should have just gone back down to the
Mhm.
valley floor. But they
Definitely.
want to go that way, and they don't want to go back down 1,000 feet. They want to keep moving on. Down the slope, the 21 members of the Donner family decided to make their own cabin shelters. On November 4th, another winter storm began. This winter storm would last 8 days.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's...
Ugh.
Yeah, that's how the snow works out here in the West. It can snow for a week solid if you know, if that's just how it works out.
Yep.
It's really something else.
Yeah, we just had a crazy storm last week.
We did.
Like, haven't had snow since, Christmas, and then all of a sudden it snows like 3 feet in a night.
Yeah, it
It
was
was
crazy. And now it's like mostly gone again.
Yeah,
It's just crazy.
The weather's weird out here.
Yeah. So, despite the relief that had come from one of their scouts, food was becoming an issue again.
Yes.
The oxen began to die, and their carcasses froze and were stacked.
Oh,
Because, you know, what else are you supposed to do with
Yeah,
their carcasses?
with a frozen cow.
Yep. Truckee Lake was an abundant source of lake trout, actually,
That's good.
but no one in the party knew how to fish for them.
Oh my God.
Eddie Sr. Shot and killed a bear, but he had little luck hunting after that. But they had bear
Yeah,
meat,
That's
and
interesting.
bear meat's edible. And
That can be dangerous though if you don't know what you're doing. And
Yeah,
I
you
feel like
gotta
if they
cook it
don't know how
right.
to fish,
Yep.
you might not know how to get rid of the trichinosis.
I know. Jeez. Yeah, things are not going well. It's funny. I'm thinking, like, you know who probably did know how to cook for lake trout was James Reed, but he's
Right.
already in California.
Or if they were like you, they'd be like, trout's gross. I'm not eating that.
I would eat it if I was starving, but yeah, trout is gross, and I would rather not if there's another option. I'll just start chewing on the oxide like they started doing later. With resources going slim, desperation began to take over. Could individuals make it across the pass where the wagons had gotten stuck?
Mhm.
When the storm passed, a small group attempted to walk over the pass, but they were also forced to turn around. It just,
Wow.
you could not make it up there. 3 later expeditions were carried out, and none of them made it across. Life at Truckee Lake was really quite miserable.
Mhm.
Cramped and filthy cabins, everyone stuck inside to avoid the storms, and chewing on oxhide for food because they just had no other food.
Yeah.
Occasionally, I mean, you think about how much food a person consumes, and you've got
Seriously.
80 people with no resources.
Yep.
Like, yeah,
Nothing.
you're gonna run out of food.
Fast.
Occasionally, the Donner Party members would catch mice in their cabins and eat them as well.
Okay.
Jacob Donner and 3 of their hired hands died of starvation. Jacob Donner being one of the older sons of
Mhm.
George Donner. Reinhardt was among them, and he confessed to killing Wolfinger on his deathbed.
Wow.
When he said they went off, and they all like, oh yeah, Native Americans got him. Yeah, he killed him. And I don't think they ever said why.
What the hell?
He just like snapped or something.
Just
I don't
hated
know. Or,
him.
well, I mean,
Was he one of the hired hands?
he was one
you're
of
you're a
my
shitty boss.
Yeah, yeah.
And killed him.
Stab you, and no one's gonna know.
And I'm gonna know where your stuff is later.
Yeah, that very well might have been it. George Donner's hand injury had become infected as well, leaving just 4 able-bodied men to do all the work at the lonely camp down the hill.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all running out of options and time. So, a group of 17 men, women, and children decided to make one final break at the mountain pass. They fashioned snowshoes out of remaining oxbows and oxhide and set off, hoping to find their way to Bear Valley and form a rescue party.
17 of them.
17.
Okay.
Some turned back early because of the harsh conditions, and it was really awkward to walk with the snowshoes. They're probably poorly built, and no one is well nourished at this point. They're starving, on the verge of starvation. By day 3, most of them had become snowblind from the snow because
it reflects
into your eyes and burns you. One man stopped to rest and told them to go on without him, and his body was found the next summer.
Oh, sad.
Yeah. They were lost and confused in the mountains. After another 2 days without food, a man named Patrick Dolan suggested that someone should volunteer to die so their body would be used for food. This is the first...
first mention of it.
Yeah, this is where the cannibalism started.
And this is with the 17 people or the people left of the
17 people on the snowshoe.
Okay.
The group couldn't settle on a method of death for this volunteer.
Did somebody actually volunteer?
No one volunteered.
Okay, they're just like, here's how we'll kill you.
They're trying to figure out who and why and who and how they would be killed.
Okay.
Like, would they draw straws or would they maybe duel each other? Jeez. They eventually settled on a tried and true method. The first person to drop dead would be eaten, which seems fair to me.
If we were ever in that situation
I guess.
And I died just like that, you could eat me.
I feel the same way. If it would help you survive,
thanks.
go ahead. I'm not using it.
Yeah.
So.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Antonio, the animal handler of the group, was the first to die of starvation, and Franklin Graves, the patriarch of the Graves family, followed shortly. Before the survivors could begin cannibalism, Patrick Dolan began to rant hysterically. This is the man who brought up cannibalism first. He then ripped off his clothes and took off into the woods.
Yes.
Which is
hypothermia thing.
He's got hypothermia. It's there's a stage of hypothermia called paradoxical undressing.
Yes.
Which is where your body sends one last false signal to your brain sends a false signal to the rest of your body that you're actually quite warm. And it's supposed to give you one last little boost of energy to get somewhere warm and not die.
But it makes you crazy.
It burns through you pretty quick. It makes you feel like your clothes are burning you. And so he rips off his clothes and takes off into the woods, which is not good for hypothermia.
Nope.
So he returned several hours later and subsequently died.
Wow.
Some members of the group began to strip his body down for food in order to save the life of Murphy Sr., who was on the verge of death. Some refused to eat the human bodies at first. The 4 people who had died were completely stripped of usable meat, and which was mostly hung to dry for later consumption. Human jerky. They put special care into making sure that no one would have to eat their own relative, which is, I guess, good considering the circumstances.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
honestly,
the morality of it is
there
interesting.
There is some different stuff, and that is interesting. Because, like I was just saying, I'd be cool if you ate me, and I would eat you,
But would you be cool with, like, anyone eating you?
I would be cool with my friends eating me.
But, like, what if like, you and a stranger were just stuck out in the
If I had just happened to die, that's
Let's
fine.
say, you weren't murdered, and you're okay, and that stranger would survive if they ate you. You'd be okay with it. That's cool.
I would eat a stranger, too.
That's very noble of you.
Yeah.
Some people might not feel the same way.
No, I totally get that.
Yeah.
But I'm, like, even thinking about it, and even with your relatives, I'm like, I know my mom would totally die for me to eat her.
Yeah, because your mom's great.
She would be like, eat me, and she'd cut off her own arm. Before she even died, she'd be like, here.
Like a Snowpiercer.
Yeah, and then roast it off, and then we'd eat it.
That's pretty dark, but I mean, you do what you can.
Yeah, it's the facts.
your body might die from shock.
I know. I'm not saying that that's a viable
even
option.
Even
really.
if you weren't starving.
I really just hope that I'm never in a situation like this.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that morally,
I mean,
I'm okay with that.
You should probably exhaust other options first.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's the conclusion you're gonna reach, is that we here at Below the Salt podcast are morally okay with cannibalism. In instances of purely survival, and if everyone's
we should just get a T-shirt that says pro cannibalism.
Yeah, I'm sure no one would think
that
was
fly.
weird. Yeah. All right, so it's interesting though. I mean, I can totally see how people would be like, no, human autonomy is too sacred a thing to violate.
Yeah, no, I totally get that,
Which
and that's
fine.
why I'm expressly giving you permission to eat me if I die.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that, and
because
I will hopefully never suffer.
My autonomous consciousness is okay with it.
Okay, well, it's same here. I appreciate that. After 3 days for searching for the trail, which of course it's under 20-something feet of snow at this point, they ran out of food again.
Yeah.
After eating the 4 people.
Mm-hmm.
They resorted to eating the ox hide on their snowshoes.
Okay.
And then they began discussing killing Salvador and Luis for more food. Which is super cool. Not cool of them.
No.
I mean, like, if someone dies of starvation...
Yeah, I wouldn't kill somebody to eat them.
No.
And if somebody tried to kill me to eat me...
If you have to murder someone to survive, maybe you shouldn't.
If the survival is eating them.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Exactly, yeah. Oh, that's true. Yeah, right. The targeted men were warned. Someone snuck over to him and said, "Hey, they're talking about killing you to eat you, so you should probably skip town." So they did. They took off into the woods. Eddie and Mary Graves, who is the mother of the Graves family, I think she was the mother. Yes, she's the mother of the Graves family.
Okay.
Nope. Hang on. She's one of the daughters of the Graves family. Eddie and Mary take off into the woods to search for food, and a man named Jay Fosdick died in the night.
Okay.
Which means there's only 7 surviving members at this point. By the time Eddie and Mary returned with the deer carcass they'd hunted, Jay's body had already been stripped down for food. So that's kind of sad. It seems like maybe they didn't have to strip him down because there's a deer carcass on the way. But man, I mean, at that point, I guess you're probably just preparing for the eventuality that you would.
Yeah. Don't let it just sit there and rot.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm being a little extra pro-cannibalism than I mean to be.
Why? Oh, just because you're like, yeah, just being flippant about cannibalism.
Yeah. I want people to know that I do think it's horrible and not something that you should do in these times.
In extreme circumstances.
Yeah.
Outside of extreme circumstances, which these very much were.
I just want to clarify that.
Yeah. It's really sad. I mean, the fact that you'd, like, I just can't imagine being in the scenario where that's on the table.
Me neither.
So, that's in an effort to seem less flippant about this. Several more days passed, and they came across the weak and starving Salvador and Luis, who had taken off to avoid being murdered for their food. They were on the verge of starvation themselves because they left before Jay had died, and they came back with the deer. So they were killed and eaten.
And they're the first ones that were actually killed.
Yes.
Wow.
On January 12th, the 7 survivors stumbled across a Native American Miwok village. That's up in the mountains.
Cool.
The Native American group was kind enough to give them some of their precious food. Very little food available, even for Native Americans in this part of the world at this time of year. The food was acorns, grasses, and pine nuts.
Nice.
So those are all things that you can harvest right from all around you during the winter. With the help of the Miwok, Eddie was able to press on and arrived at a small farming community at the edge of the Sacramento Valley on January 17th.
Nice.
The journey from Truckee Lake to Sacramento had taken 33 days and cost 10 lives.
Jeez.
Yeah. That's the end of that little leg of the trip.
Sad.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's really, really quite brutal.
So of those 17, there were 7 alive?
Well, 7 survived, and 3 of them had turned back at the very beginning, so...
Okay, so 4 at the end. Okay, wow.
James Reed made it through the Sierra Nevadas in late October, just before the pass was closed up with snow. He mounted up a rescue party immediately. To his credit, he didn't.
Yeah,
he wasn't
that's
just like,
nice.
"Fuck my family, I'm gonna go be a bachelor now." No, he mounted up a rescue party and took off into the mountains to retrieve his family, which he assumed they had made it. He assumed they made it to Bear Valley because they were basically right behind him, but the snow was timed just so. When they arrived to find that Bear Valley was empty, the party disbanded itself, and Reed and McClutchan, who had gone with him, tried to press the gap above Truckee Lake to get over to the lake.
Okay.
They didn't know where the family was.
No.
They didn't know they were at Truckee Lake, but they were forced to return.
Okay.
They didn't make it as far as the Truckee Lake Valley. This was on the same day that one of the 4 expeditions from the other side had tried to cross from the opposite side. It's possible that the 2 groups were within a mile or so of each other at one point, but they were unable to make contact with each other.
Sucks, bruh.
Yeah. Reed then returned to San Jose, which is where they were intending to live in the first place. He tried to drum up support for a second rescue attempt, but with the ongoing Mexican-American War soaking up most of the local resources, he didn't have much luck getting any handouts.
Okay.
After Eddie reached Sacramento and news about the ill-fated Donner Party had reached Reed and many other immigrants in the San Jose area, Reed was able to get the support he needed.
That's good.
Which is really cool. Like, San Jose was like, these guys are stuck up there and they're being forced to eat each other. Like, yeah, we need to get up there and help them out. And all those immigrants had known how dangerous that area is. So they're like, yeah, let's go help out.
That's good.
So the second rescue party, after braving the harsh conditions of the mountain passes, finally reached the camp at Truckee Lake on February 18th, 1847. Upon their arrival, Mrs. Murphy popped out of her snow-covered cabin and asked, "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?"
Oh.
She thought maybe she died, or that angels had come to claim them. Yeah, it's really quite sad. 13 of the campsite members had died since the snowshoe group had embarked. Their bodies were buried in the snow. Some of the survivors seemed pretty emotionally unstable from the campsite area. 7 extremely starved Donner family members were rescued from their distant cabin down the hill. George Donner's arm had become so gangrenous he couldn't even move. He was forced to stay behind after the rescue party left.
That sucks, man.
He stayed behind with Kesselberg for later rescue efforts. Down at the Donner cabin, they had been forced to consume the body of Jacob Donner and 3 others to survive. So 2 separate instances of cannibalism. The rescuers didn't have the heart to tell the campers what had become of most of the snowshoe party, and they told them that they'd been held up in Sacramento to recover. The trip back to Sacramento was not easy, despite all the resources that had been brought along by the rescue party. John Denton, with barely any strength at all, passed into a coma on attempting to cross the mountain pass and died.
Oh.
A blizzard struck when they were descending from the pass, and 5-year-old Isaac Donner froze to death.
Sad.
When they made camp, Mary Donner's feet were badly burned because she was so frostbitten she couldn't feel that they had fallen into the fire.
Oh my God.
Young, malnourished Ada Kesselberg couldn't handle the rigors of climbing the mountain and also passed away when they reached camp.
Wow.
When they descended into Bear Valley, Margaret and James Reed were reunited at last. So the guy who had been exiled, he finally managed to see his wife again. They subsequently collapsed into the snow together. On the journey back to Sacramento, they did survive.
Good.
I didn't want it to seem like they died.
They didn't fight each other and
they
then
ran
die.
to each other and hugged each other and fell over into the snow. Which is actually kind of cute. It's like I kind of hated James Reed at the beginning of the story, but at the end I'm like, okay, he's not like the worst.
Cool.
On the journey back to Sacramento, William Hook, who was Jacob Donner's stepson, broke into one of the food crates of the rescue party and fatally gorged himself on food because he was so hungry. They were trying to ration their
Yeah, because if you eat so much, you're gonna hurt yourself.
Yes, and he did pass
if you
away
weren't just an asshole breaking into other people's food.
He was desperate, I imagine.
No, I
but
get it. I don't want to be mean.
He really should have.
Still.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. The
story's just sad because there's so many people just being fucking idiots.
There's a lot of and there's some that's negligence. There's some that's just ignorance, and there's some that's malicious.
Yep.
So there's all sorts of bad decisions
it's sad.
being made. It's really, really sad. So they have to go back and rescue George Donner and a few others that were left behind because they were too ill to move from the February rescue party.
Did they leave them like with the supplies though?
Yes, they left them with quite a few supplies, but things still go wrong.
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, with this group of people, of course things go wrong. Upon the final rescue attempt in March to retrieve the last of the survivors, Eddie himself, who had been the only person to actually cross the mountains from the biggest group, had recovered enough to return. Upon arriving at Truckee Lake, Eddie discovered that all of his children had passed.
Oh, sad.
And Keseberg had admitted to eating his son's remains.
Oh, man.
Eddie was heartbroken and betrayed. He vowed to kill Keseberg if they ever crossed paths in California. George Donner was still too unhealthy to move. He was left behind yet again, with Keseberg and a few more unhealthy survivors. A salvage operation was sent in April to go pick up the stuff. And presumably rescue George Donner and Keseberg, who were among the last of the people there. They discovered that George Donner had died only days before they arrived.
Oh, no.
Tamsin Donner, who had stayed behind with her husband George, had attempted to go across the pass when her husband had died, but actually perished in the cold.
Oh, no.
The salvage party then found pieces of human remains in the cooking pot in Keseberg's cabin, along with George Donner's pistols, jewelry, and gold.
Oh my God, he robbed them.
Keseberg explained that Tamsin Donner had instructed him to cache the goods on her behalf when she left, but the salvage party was unconvinced and brought him back to Sacramento under guard with the last of the survivors.
Wow.
They're pretty sure that Keseberg also killed Tamsin Donner. Of the 87 souls who entered the Wasatch Mountains with the original group, 48 survived the journey.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a little bit more than half.
Wow.
I think half would be, slightly more than half. The Reed and Breen families survived completely intact, actually.
Nice.
The Donners were orphaned. Both of their parents had died with Keseberg. And Eddie was the lone survivor of his family. Most of the Murphy family had perished as well, and only 3 of the original mules from the trip survived to get to San Francisco. The Reeds all moved to San Jose, adopted 2 of the Donner children, and went on to financial success during the gold rush of 1849.
Should we call it the Reed Pass?
I know, right? The other Donner children were taken in by an older couple in Sutter's Fort, California.
Good.
The Murphys settled in Marysville, California, and the Breens went on to open an inn in San Juan Bautista.
Cool.
Isabella Breen, the youngest survivor of the Donner Party, who was 18 months old when all this happened, only passed away in 1935.
Nice.
So she survived to live a very long, full life.
That's great.
Mary Graves, the badass who had actually survived the trip into the mountains and hunted a deer. She's super cool. She actually lived a very sad life after the Donner Party.
Oh, sad.
She married when she arrived in town because California was very men heavy at the time. So any women were very had their pick of the litter when they came into California. Her new husband was actually murdered.
Oh, damn.
When this happened, the murderer was captured and imprisoned. She decided to take a job as a cook in the prison that housed his killer. In her words, she wished to ensure that the condemned man lived to see the noose.
Oh my God.
She said she wanted to make sure that he made it. She was going to cook all of his meals for him and make sure that he was never poisoned by anyone, and that his food was okay, because she wanted to make sure that he got hung.
That's crazy.
By the law.
Wow.
It's super crazy. She said of the incident, "I wish I could cry, but I cannot. If I could forget the tragedy, perhaps I would know how to cry again." Eddie, and that's all we really know about Eddie.
That is
Mary
sad.
Graves. We don't know much about her story after that point. Eddie remarried and started a family in San Jose. And he was eventually dissuaded from his vengeance campaign against Keseberg by his friend and neighbor, James Reed.
Nice.
Keseberg, this guy, filed a defamation suit against the members of the Salvage Party who had accused him of murdering Tamsin Donner. He was awarded $1 in damages and was made to pay court costs. So basically he lost money by trying to sue them.
Even back then, $1 not a lot.
Nope. The Salvage Party made note during the suit that Keseberg had not partaken of the newly thawed cattle and horse carcasses, but had preferred to eat human flesh instead. Historians disagree as to his guilt for the crime of murder. And that wraps up the story of the Donner Party.
That's pretty intense. I want to talk a little. I want to just say that after our last episode that we did last week, Skinwalker Ranch, I mentioned that I knew a lot about stories of like Wendigos.
Oh yeah.
And one of the versions is very similar to what happens in Donner Pass.
Ooh, okay.
That just a group of Native Americans had gotten trapped in a cave during a snowstorm and weren't able to get out, and they went through all their resources and they were starving, and one of them suggested like, oh, maybe we should kill one of us. One of us needs to die and the rest of us can survive by eating them. And of course the whole group is like, no, that's not happening.
That's not cool.
And so the guy who suggested it waited until everybody else was asleep and then came back and murdered one of them to eat. And everybody of course was horrified and they banned him from the group. Nobody else partook of the dead man.
Wow.
Except for the guy, the one. And so they kicked him out of the group and he became the first Wendigo.
The first Wendigo. That's a great origin story.
I know, and it's Wendigo. Because the act of evil that turned him into that. And it was like a big...
It's kind of like a selfish act. Like,
oh, heck yeah.
I want to survive, so I'm going to kill someone else to eat them. Yep. Rather than the best of the group or waiting until someone dies.
Exactly. And it was during a big windy snowstorm, right? And they say that you can always know when the Wendigo is near or coming because you can hear it whispering your name under the wind. Or its own name, just Wendigo. Just like that.
That's horrifying?
Yeah.
And I'm never going out in the snow again?
No.
Yeah.
There's lots of Wendigo stories, but that's just one of the versions.
That does stick out a little bit, especially considering the circumstances of the Donner Party. Well, I hope you enjoyed this tale of woe from the mountains.
Yeah, it was
good. Utah played a small but very important part in this story, and so we were happy to do some research and share all about the Donner Party for you guys.
Yep.
Well, I think that does it for us. I'm Jack.
I'm Valerie.
And this is Below the Salt.